If you're going to understand zoology, if you're going to understand biology, you need to understand the principles of evolution. So we're going to go today and talk about the evidence which supports this theory. And next time we'll talk about more particulars of how evolution works. So evolution, as we said before, is the basis for our understanding a lot of the organization of different animals and how animals themselves function within their environment. What is evolution? Well, it is a scientific theory. A theory is something which is well established, has lots of evidence to support it. So it's not just a theory, it is actually a well documented theory and given a lot of clout as something that is true in biology. There are definitely nuances to it and little individual things which are uncertain and are still being worked out, but for all intents and purposes, the basics of it are understood as important to understanding biology and thus zoology. So it helps us to understand or gives a reason why we have such a diversity of life, so why we have so many different types of organisms. It helps us understand the characteristics of living organisms and why they are adapted to certain environments. Why do all things which swim in freshwater streams have streamlined bodies and suction cups on their heads and things that are adapted to their environment? A simple definition of evolution is that it's a proportion of traits and populations of living organisms that changes over time, and it can change due to one of two main reasons. The first is the natural environment is changing, or the populations are changing in their characteristics to better match or fit the environmental conditions in which it lives. That would be natural selection. And then the second mode of evolution would be randomness. So sometimes just by random chance, certain characteristics are expressed more in a population than others. Randomness is often ignored, but it is also an important aspect of evolution. So I have a few examples here. I've got the evolution of whales. These are all drawings based on fossils found over millions of years, which show a pattern or almost a step-by-step process by which we had an aquatic, semi-aquatic organism on the top there that had webbed feet and probably lived around the edges of oceans, into more and more characteristics, including a reduced number of limbs and a fluke and flippers and streamlined body, into what we now have as understand the body form of modern day whales, such as dolphins and killer whales and blue whales and mammals that belong in that group. So you see here then a diversity of organisms. You see matching environmental conditions with the characteristics of those different organisms and their environment. On the other side, we've got moths over here, and here the moths are pretty much the same, and the moths are given as an example in industrial England, where the color of the trees changed. So the environment changed. It went from white birch trees to black birch trees, and that allowed a shift in the population to acquire more darker moths, which were more camouflage in the darker trees. And so we see a natural selection event there, shifting the characteristics found within a population from lighter moths to darker moths. That is evolution as well. Now, evolution has been on trial since its inception, but there was a famous trial called the Scopes trial in the 1930s, I believe, where some famous lawyers took both pro-evolution and anti-evolution stance. It was more of a charade than anything. A teacher was teaching evolution when in Tennessee it was illegal to do so, and so they used this as an opportunity to argue the tenets of evolution. And we aren't going to go through the trial, but they mentioned a lot of the things which we're going to mention as well. There were some ideas on which Darwin and Alfred Wallace built their ideas upon, right? So the way science works, you don't just magically come up with a theory that is fully perfect and wonderful on your own. It often is because you are borrowing or thinking or developing or building on other ideas which have come before you. So a few of these ideas include Lamarckism, and Lamarck was saying that basically everything that Darwin was saying, except for the mode of inheriting traits, of evolutionary traits, was through what's called acquired characteristics. Essentially, if an organism needed to adjust their characteristics towards an environmental match, such as a giraffe stretching its neck out towards the tops of the trees, that trait would then be passed to the offspring. Then the next offspring would have a longer neck. The next generation of offspring would have a longer neck. So a lot of these things are actually the way evolution works, except that mode of inheritance doesn't work like that. Creationism was another popular opinion, which after this time was defended more vigorously. But the idea that the Earth was only 6,000 years old is an interpretation of the biblical view of the 6 days of creation, each 1,000 years each. It's not really a scientific explanation, but was often held by scientists because they were Christian, at least in this part of the world. Gradualism is the process that the Earth accumulates small incremental changes over very long periods of time. Creationism is opposite to this thinking that, well, things actually occurred after a short period of time and then out of nothing everything was put in its place. Well, gradualism is that things are changing ever so slightly, and the animals and things that we see in the fossil record are also changing in that very small amount of time, but accumulated over very, very long periods of time, billions of years, is what gives us the result of what we see today. Uniformitarianism is another important part, which is that the laws which govern the universe millions of years ago, also billions of years ago, also govern the universe now, and so we can rely on these same principles to understand the Earth and how it was formed and the life that is in it today. So these are all influencing Darwin or counteracting Darwin and his ideas at the time. So there were two people who are credited for coming to the same conclusions of evolution by natural selection, Alfred Wallace and Charles Darwin. They were both explorers, both kind of gathered information from similar sources, albeit from different parts of the world, and they published this first essay in 1858 together, co-authored it. Within there you see this term called descent with modification. So each generation, each progeny has a small change, slightly different than the previous generation. And over time that will accumulate in a diversity of organisms matched to their environment and their niche. All right, again, this is changes in traits in a population over time. And we're going to focus on Darwin and what he accumulated in his knowledge. Alfred Wallace, to a lesser extent, also accumulated a lot of these same things, but just didn't create a full body of work and publish it like Darwin did. So one of the things that influenced Darwin was that he was aboard a worldwide voyage called the Voyage of the Beagle. The Beagle was the name of the ship. And the Captain Fitzroy, wanted some companionship, and so he brought along this naturalist, Charles Darwin. While Darwin was on here, he read books, He he took notes. He gathered specimens from all the different places they went. And as he's doing this, he's noticing different things about the geology, about the different types of plants and animals and organisms and geological processes. And one of the influences was, one of the places he went was the Galapagos Islands, which was out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, very isolated. No one lived there. And he collected finches, he collected mockingbirds and other things. He actually didn't do a very good job of like even documenting which birds came from which island. And this wasn't actually a significant part of his thesis, but it probably did influence his thoughts as he observed these very weird islands with a diverse group of species, and including these finches, which looked a lot like the ones in the mainland, but they all had different specializations. So thinking was, all right, he's seeing these finches and saying, all right, well, they probably came from a common ancestor. So again, the Galapagos Islands probably had an influence on Darwin, but not as much as you might think or you might hear. It's kind of take on a little bit of a legend. And you can see that if you've ever gone to the Galapagos Islands, which I have. I went there on a study abroad trip with a bunch of students a couple years ago. And there were these edifices of Darwin all over the place. Here's one on the left of old Darwin with finches in his head. We've got different statues. Here I am shaking hands with the middle-aged Darwin, and we've got an old middle-aged giant statue of Darwin with our whole class, and then this bust of Darwin. All of these are scattered throughout, and there's probably more that we didn't see the Galapagos Islands. So they have embraced Darwin as a part of the culture of the Galapagos, and definitely you can learn a lot about evolution by looking at the different organisms which have evolved on these different islands. So Darwin didn't only take biological evidence into account. He also looked at geology, and this essay by Malthus, who was an economist, who noticed that there are a lot of people born, but not all of them survive, and that there is some limitation in the amount of people that an area can sustain based on resources. So there must be some sort of selecting mechanism. And Malthus was more concerned with the idea that overpopulation was going to outgrow the amount of resources. But you could see with this logical idea that you could understand that, oh, well, if we are producing more people and not all of them are coming to adulthood, then there must be something preventing these people from becoming adults, and we would call that selection, right? So some sort of traits are allowing others to live and others to not live. All right, so the question was, all right, well, what accounts for this? What's the difference? And can then those traits be inherited onto other future generations? The answer, of course, is yes. Again, geologists such as Lyell and his book called Principles of Geology. Lyell was a proponent of two of those philosophies we talked about, gradualism and uniformitarianism, and used those to understand principles of geology, such as how could there be an abundance of sea creatures fossilized in limestone? And his idea was, well, perhaps limestone itself is actually the broken up and compressed and very old composition of seashells, and it's made of the same thing. And over millions of years, it creates this form of rock, right? So Darwin read this, looked and observed similar things, and thought, well, maybe the Earth is actually millions and billions of years old, and that would give you enough time for evolution to make enough tiny changes to account for the diversity of life which we see today. All right, so on the right here we've got some limestone and some fossilized creatures which are stuck in that limestone as it formed. Artificial selection. So Darwin was a pigeon breeder, and he was able to actually breed a number of different types of pigeons. So believe it or not, the pigeons you see at the park are, those are your kind of wild, natural state. But you can take those and mate certain colors and breeds and come up with a very big variety of different types of pigeons. And so this is showing that there is actually a diversity of traits within a population, and they can be selected or pushed in one way or another artificially. Other examples of this include the wild plant Brassica oleracea has actually been domesticated in many different ways to produce different types of vegetables that we eat, but they're all the same plant. So cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, these are actually all the same plant. They've just been selected in different ways to emphasize different traits that we use for different foods. So Darwin published his book in 1859. It was a big undertaking, and he didn't even think it was ready when he actually finally did publish it, but he did finally publish it. And there were multiple actually editions of it published later where he added, took things away. But the main points that he makes can be broken down into these 5 areas: perpetual change, common descent, multiplication of species, gradualism, and natural selection. So we've explained a few of these, but essentially critiques of and or evidence of the theories of evolution hinge on these main points. When it came out, it received criticism because it didn't identify a method of inheritance. The fossil record wasn't very complete, so it didn't really look like you could see evolution or evidence of evolution in the fossil record. And again, the age of the Earth was thought to be thousands of years old, not millions or billions of years old, which would be needed in order to account for the gradual changes of evolution. Well, there's been a lot of information and biological studies which have come out since the publication of the book, including genetics. So Gregor Mendel published his work around the same time that Darwin published his, but they never saw each other's work, or at least Darwin never saw Gregor Mendel's work. And so it wasn't added to that body of evidence until much later when it was rediscovered after both of them had passed on. But Mendel did show that traits could be passed from one generation to the next and different ways that that could happen. And so now you had a mode of inheritance in a study called genetics. I should also mention that genetics today is hinged on the discovery of DNA and specific sequences that we can identify for specific genes. So it's taken on even more of a dramatic emphasis on evidence for evolution. All right, the fossil record became more complete since Darwin's publication as well. We see a lot of missing links or intermediate fossils, including in human evolution, whale evolution, horse evolution is a great example of how you can see from one to the next. I talked about whale evolution before, and can also show us these extinction events which occur in the fossil record. And there are 5 extinction events. We consider man's presence and explosion on the Earth to be causing a 6th extinction. Each of them was generally a catastrophic event which caused them. And you have anywhere from 70 to 95% of species going extinct during this time. So all of these things show that, or add to the evidence that evolution by natural selection is occurring. We have molecular evidence, as I mentioned before, DNA, RNA, proteins. These things can now be used in comparative models and understand relationships between organisms and what organisms have a common ancestor and how long ago that happened. Comparative anatomy. So we can see that pretty much all organisms that have a common ancestor have a common anatomy, and that even if they diverge in their functions, their anatomy is still similar. So, for example, this red bone on all of the human, dog, bird, and whale here is the ulna, which forms your elbow and is a part of your forearm. Well, the bone is there in all of them, a human, dog, bird, and whale, even if it's used slightly differently. So we can see the same structures being used, indicating a common ancestor. All right. If they have the same function but different structure, then that would be an analogous. These are homologous structures where they have the same structure but have different functions. So as the whale uses it to swim, and the bird to fly, and the dog to run, and the human to, pick things up, they're all derived from the same bone, the ulna. Another comparative anatomy is when you look at embryonic development, you will see early in embryonic development, things are pretty much the same across related taxa. And there's a saying, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which basically means the early development of different organisms will follow the evolutionary history of those organisms as well, and can show ancestry, common ancestry, and where ancestry has diverged. So again, you can see the different vertebrates here early in their development. They all look pretty much the same. It is until later where you can show differences. The age of the Earth has shown to be billions of years old, and that has been done through radiocarbon and other elemental dating, where we can look at the half-life of radioactive decay of elements in different minerals and geological structures to determine how old different parts of the Earth are. And again, it's shown to be billions of years old enough for evolution to take place. All right, biogeography is another great evidence of evolution, where you have different areas of the Earth with the same conditions. So a desert over here in the United States and the desert over here in Africa can produce similar characteristics in this fox, right? So the fox has big ears and short limbs and a bushy tail in both areas. That's because they grew in the same environment. So showing that environment can influence traits. Whereas another fox in a different environment, the Arctic fox, is going to have a whole host of different characteristics because it was under a different environment. All right. So finally, the last evidence that we have, and there are more evidences, and we could have kind of added them, but we just don't have time to go through every minute detail. But one other big one is vestigial structures, which is basically structures in anatomy that animals or plants or whatever have that just don't have any function because they are an evolutionary remnant. So an example of this would be the leg bones in a whale. Well, whales don't have legs. They have no need for legs. In fact, it would get in the way. And so over time, the structures which form legs have become reduced to almost absent to now where they have these bones that are just floating in blubber, not attached to anything, and they don't do anything either. Instead, they have this large fluke in the back, and that's what they use to propel themselves through the water. So these leg bones, there's even leg bones in snakes as well, which don't need or use legs as well. Humans have plenty of vestigial structures, such as the ability to form goosebumps. Doesn't really do anything for you. You don't have any hair on your body to stand on end. And so this is evidence that, all right, well, you derived your characters from an ancestor that used this, but now it's no longer important for your environment. So your population or the population you came from has changed over time, and perhaps the environment that you live in has changed over time, and those things have matched to create some vestigial structures. Okay, so this in totality is the evidence we have to support evolution, which is very founded as a theory of biological significance and important for us to understand zoology.